So our first speaker today, of course, is Malcolm Gladwell, a journalist and writer who isn't shy about offering his opinions about higher education. He's the author of 5 New York Times best-selling books, including Tipping Point and Blink. He's also the co-founder of Pushkin Industries, an audio content company that produces the podcast Revisionist History. Pushkin is an underwriter for today's program as well. Pushkin recently published an audiobook collecting Malcolm's podcast about higher education that's entitled I Hate the Ivy League. So as I said, someone who's not shy about sharing his opinions about higher education. Malcolm, welcome to Cronfest. Malcolm, are you able to join us?
There I am. Oops.
Great.
Hold on.
Thanks.
I thought, oh yeah. Oh, there we are. So
there we go. Always having challenges in the Zoom world, I realize.
Yes.
Well, Malcolm, as I said, you are not shy about your opinions about higher education. This is a chance to talk to our audience directly about some of those ideas, and I do appreciate you taking the time to be here today. And, you know, I led off today talking about these big numbers, these public concerns, this growing distrust or disconnect between what the public sees as the value of higher education and hopefully perhaps what higher education is actually providing. I'm going to kind of get your take on that. Why do you think there's been this decline in what folks are saying is a sort of less positive impact on higher education on the country?
Well, there's obvious ones, reasons that you would know as well as I do. You know, the cost of higher education has soared, but I think people's perception to higher education have not increased at the same rate. I mean, we are happy to pay more for something if we think we're getting something greater in return.
Right.
That doesn't seem to be the case with higher ed. I also think the kind of thing I've been focused on is the kind of public conversation about what a quality education is. And I feel like that on that specific question, we don't have a common definition or a working definition of what a good education is. If you ask people, you ask, you know, I have a book called I Hate the Ivy League. In the Ivy League, the characteristics of a quality of education are how fancy the dorms are, how much money the university has in the bank, how many big names it attracts to campus, you know, the kind of income level of your peers, which are all things that are of little or no relevance to the lives of most Americans. You know, a simple metric like how good is a school at raising someone from the bottom 20th percentile to the top 20th percentile?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds to me like a really good metric of a quality education. One of, not the only one, but if you gave me a definition of what a quality school was, I would say a school that successfully gives students a chance to improve the social and economic circumstances that they came from is a good school.
Right.
The fact that that's not at the center of our kind of public definition is nuts. And that's why people are kind of walking away. They're saying, what are you talking about? You know, why is the conversation so disconnected from people's, you know, real needs in this area?
Right. And there has been, I mean, a movement toward talking more about social mobility. I mean, there are new rankings coming out. There have been rankings that have come out to kind of measure that and put different schools in front of people to say, hey, here's a different way of measuring their quality aside from what are sort of the more well-known rankings like US News. So there is something of a discussion that's happening more about that topic, or do you feel like it's happening? It doesn't sound like it's happening enough in your mind.
Well, I don't feel like it's sufficiently driving the behavior of the schools themselves.
Right.
The schools themselves are reacting to kind of market incentives. If I'm the president of a university, what is the best way to increase my status amongst my peers, my income, my reputation, my longevity? It's not by increasing, you know, social and economic opportunities for those at the bottom. No, it's by building a kind of replica of an Ivy League school. It's by increasing the endowment and letting in a smaller and smaller fraction of applicants and all the things that let you rise in the rankings. You know, we have been people like many people, not just me, many of us had been railing against the incentive structure created by these ranking systems
Right.
decades. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't seem to change the behavior of the overwhelming majority of school presidents and boards. I think boards are probably just as important here.
I mean, there's a lot of factors there. I mean, that's something I want to ask you about. I mean, you have I think, a great conversation with the U.S. News folks, Robert Morris, in your podcast. But also, I mean, what can college presidents do about it? I mean, you pose it to Walter Kimbrough, the president of Dillard. You suggest, hey, why not just not play the game as Reed College has done, right? Reed College sort of notably dropped out of the rankings years ago. Whereas Reed is somewhat rarefied air. They can kind of do that because their reputation doesn't necessarily need it, and they're relatively wealthy. I mean, would you encourage, say, more college presidents to say, just don't play this game anymore, just step out? Because I think the reality of that is probably hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, I do think a collective boycott would be a really good idea at this point. I don't know whether that ultimately solves the problem, because remember,
Sure.
parents are still, there's a sector of affluent parents who are also part of the engine of this sort of nuttiness.
Right.
And about this idea that the single most important factor in the future success of their child is the brand value of the college they attend, which is crazy. I mean, there is no idea more lunatic than the idea that just by virtue of going to a school that has a recognizable brand, you will be assured a life of wealth and riches and endless promotions when you enter the workforce. No, the minute you step into the workforce, you are evaluated for what you do in the workforce. I can't even tell you, honestly, Pushkin has, at this point, for example, is, I don't know, say 75 employees. I could probably tell you the alma maters of, I don't know, 5 of those employees.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have to work at it. And it honestly never crosses my mind. You're evaluated by what you do. And so this is another one of the lies that we're telling people. We've telling people that somehow an education's value has to do with brand, as opposed to the actual preparation it gives you for your life in the workforce. And that's another reason why people are like shrugging and saying, well, this conversation makes no sense to me.
Yeah, you propose, I think, an interesting idea. I think maybe unrealistic in your podcast about saying, hey, let's have a don't ask, don't tell policy when it comes to the university during hiring. That is, employers don't ask and applicants don't tell. Essentially, I mean, that seems like you never ask. So that's what I wanted to ask. So in your actual practical hiring at Pushkin, you just don't ask at all. Do you ask not to see it on the resume? You don't see to dive into it at all?
I'm not sure of the specific. I'm talking about my own personal.
Sure.
When I hire assistants and staff, I never ask. I think Pushkin does the same. I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, it's a completely irrelevant fact, right? I mean, I want to know. It's useless as a predictor. So why would we gather that information?
Right.
It will be like asking, do I ask someone's height? I mean, do I ask, I don't know, like the color of their eyes? I mean, it matters to me that you went to college.
Mm-hmm.
But even there, I don't know. Is that a surefire predictor? Lots of people who are very good at what they do can go to college. I mean, I suppose I'm interested in whether you're intellectually, I'm really interested in is, are you intellectually curious? If you manage to satisfy your intellectual curiosity without going to college, I would say good for you.
Right.
But I mean, it's just like, we need to be, I do think that general idea, the don't ask, don't tell policy was this notion that we need to decouple the decision about whether you go to college and the workplace. So if you want to go to join the rat race and try and get into Princeton, fine, but just be assured that your attendance there is not going to give you any kind of advantage when it comes time to applying for jobs. In other words, let's clarify the reasons why you go to a college. Mm-hmm. If Princeton has the best classics departments in the country, and you are crazy about Latin and Greek, that should be your reason for going to Princeton. Not because you think it'll help you get a job at Goldman Sachs once you've graduated, right? That's I once had this conversation years ago with someone from Goldman Sachs after the financial crisis. And they said, after the financial crisis, their star had fallen so far that the students from Harvard, Yale, and MIT and Princeton were no longer applying for those entry-level analyst positions at Goldman Sachs. And I said, oh, so where are your analysts coming from? And I said, oh, second-tier schools. And they mentioned, Davidson or, and I said, what's your experience with that class of analysts been? He said, oh, it was the best class we ever had. And then I checked to see whether they learned from this experience and stopped, exclusively pursuing students from these so-called elite schools. They didn't. They went back to their old way, even though
Right.
empirical evidence was that. So it's like we're trapped in this crazy universe where people are just obsessed with the wrong things.
Yeah, how do we break that? I mean, and to your question of what is a quality education, how do you define it? What is higher education for? Because yesterday we had this, and this is a perennial debate, right? Is it for career development? Is it for creating the job skills? Or is it for kind of creating those citizens that are going to hopefully fuel our democracy in the future and rounding out that person in different ways? And it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. I know that's sort of how we present it, but I'm just kind of curious on your take on that. Because it seems like you're suggesting somewhat that hiring should be based not obviously on the reputation of the school, it should be purely skills based, which then sort of says, well, what's the value of that degree then if the person says, hey, I just don't want to have an interest in higher education at all in terms of getting a career. It's all about me making the ROI case of getting the best job I want, and that doesn't involve having a degree. Great, then that sort of undercuts, I worry, a little bit what the value of higher education may be for people.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to get away from a single definition of what excellence means in the college level.
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that's always puzzled me about higher ed in this country and in others is how much similarity there is among the kind of more selective schools, but even more broadly than that. They all seem to be pursuing the same model. They all want to house you for 4 years on a beautiful campus. They want to teach you in the same kind of way. They want to have an athletic program that, is kind of baked into the life of everyone's pursuing the same recipe. And a few with some interesting, fascinating exceptions, and I really, that's what I find bizarre. There should be, when you sit down to decide what college you want to go to as a high school senior, you should be choosing among dramatically different options.
Mm-hmm.
It should be like choosing a restaurant, right? Do I want to go to a fast food place? Do I want to eat Thai? Do I want to eat, a steakhouse?
Yes, in the podcast you said McDonald's, Arby's, and Taco Bell. I think we can have it maybe be
that's right.
A broader range. I just like to say, I think fast casual.
There should be dramatically different models. There should be way more work study.
And I think I think there are dramatically different models. I mean, there's online now. It's obviously there's some institutions that are doing it well. There obviously something I don't hear a lot of you focus on. It's like there's a whole community college system, right? That's very different than what we have through the rest of the system. I mean, it does seem like we have got dramatically different models. I just, maybe to your point, I'm not sure students understand it well enough, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a couple of examples of maybe what I'm saying is that there ought to be more, let me name a couple of schools that are distinctive. West Point, St. John's, Arizona State, Hope College in Michigan, which is going to this pay it forward. I almost goes Hope. Those are one-offs. I think there should be 100 St. John's.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
There should be 100 versions of a military academy where you're giving back in service. You're getting an education, but you're going to serve for some period of time. That's what I mean. The top should look
very diverse.
Yeah, diverse. It should not look as homogeneous as it does.
No, I understand, and I think that makes more sense in the sense that we can point to some of these dramatically different types of institutions, but to say, hey, we've got the depth of diversity that you're asking for in terms of the offerings.
Yeah.
And of course, back to the point that most people, when they are looking at institutions, they just know the brand names at this point, for the most part.
But someone who went to the University of Chicago in the 60s was saying, in the 60s, the University of Chicago stood for something very distinctive. It was the nerdy place you went if you wanted to read books with other super nerdy kids. And it was full of weirdness and all kinds of things. And he was lamenting, this guy, that Chicago is slowly turning itself into just another, exclusive private school. And that's what I'm talking about. Why shouldn't Chicago stay weird? It was much more valuable to America as in its weird 60s incarnation than it is in its shiny 21st century incarnation.
I'm seeing a bumper sticker or a campaign: "Stay weird, higher education."
Stay weird, exactly. Higher education.
I do have a question here coming in from the audience. It's something I kind of want to pose to you. I mean, this is from an attendee named Eric, and he's asking you, is your critique mostly of flagships and elite privates, as public flagships, those big state institutions, but may not apply to the regional public comprehensives that make up so much of the higher education? I do think, obviously, you say, I hate the Ivy League. You focus on some of those bigger schools. I do want to make sure people know, hey, you have a visit at Dillard, the HBCU down in Louisiana. You do have Glassboro State you talk up as well. So you're well aware of those, but do you feel like, I mean, is there a slightly different critique, or is there something you'd say differently about those regional publics, those smaller institutions that are probably less wealthy? I guess maybe part of my question here is also, do you feel like focusing so much on the Ivy League and the challenges there, do you feel like you take up all the oxygen and not talk about what is really where most people go to colleges, and to talk about, hey, what can we do to make sure those feel supported and also have to improve, because they certainly face significant challenges as well.
Well, Ian, first, I'm not done yet. I'm at the beginning.
You're just getting started.
And so I will admit, the beginning of my crusade has been very focused on the Ivy League, but there's a reason for that. And that is they're soaking up not just all the attention, but a lot of the dollars. So, if you look at the the Ivy League schools plus Stanford and MIT, collectively among them have, I've forgotten how many hundreds of billions of dollars in endowment. There's an enormous amount of money that is poised in this country to go into higher ed, and it's all going in the same place.
Yes, the GDP of some countries.
Yeah. So job one is to redirect that money. When some hedge fund guy gives $500 million, he should not be. And that's starting to happen now with some of the kind of new.
Well, Mackenzie Scott being, I think, a good example.
Being the brilliant example. But I do think the other thing, the next stage in this, I think, is to revive public funding for public institutions.
Right.
Right now, a lot of public universities are public in name only. They're not getting any. University of Michigan's not getting any money from the state of Michigan, not appreciably. I heard an administrator from UVA tell me they would be happier if the state stopped funding them, because the state gives them almost no money and then attaches all kinds of conditions to their operation. So let's make it. I would love to go back to a period like we had in the 50s, where public, with that tier of public education, strove very hard to be affordable. Now, you can do affordable in a number of ways: higher levels of public commitments, lower levels of amenity. I'd like to pursue both. I think it's really, really important to restore the kind of economic value of university education.
And in some ways, you're sparked by your interest in higher ed because you grew up in a different system. And I wonder how much you want us to emulate the Canadian system where you grew up. You said it was very different. And that seems to be, I think, interest, because, I used to be the international editor at the Chronicle. And yes, the systems around the world are quite different than the US. US is pretty distinct. But as you said, I think when you visit to South Korea, and I've certainly heard this in some travels I've done, is how much they want to emulate our system. And I find that sort of that dichotomy kind of interesting.
Yeah. I grew up in Canada. And so, I graduated in 1984, but my tuition was, at the time I graduated, well under $1,000 a year. So there's a situation where I effectively, I graduated with no debt and paid for my entire education, almost my entire education, through working in the summers. Mm-hmm. So that's a model, and that requires a very, very generous amount of state support. And I think, but the school had an amenity level that was much lower than is common in American campuses. So I do believe very strongly in that model. I don't have any kind of I don't have any problem with the thing that America does really well, which is this kind of elite research university.
Right.
That's the reason when the Koreans say we want our system, they don't mean they want to torture their 17-year-olds with their decision about it. What they want is MIT and Stanford. They want these schools that are engines of intellectual and economic development for their country. And I think that's a totally legit. I like that too. The function of those schools in the development of, the intellectual, the economic development in this country in the last 50 years has been unparalleled. We would be nowhere without Stanford. Where is biotech without MIT and Harvard? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's, where is Silicon Valley without Stanford and Caltech and Berkeley? So that part is enormously valuable, but you don't need, the thing is, so much of what we do in supporting elite higher education is disconnected from that high intellectual function. In fact, we make the lives of people who are pursuing that incredibly valuable part of higher education, we make their lives miserable.
The faculty, you're saying?
We had them spend all day writing grant applications. It's nuts. But do you think that one thing Princeton could do with its $37 billion endowment is they could free all of their researchers from ever having to apply for a grant again? Do they do that? No, they don't. What does that tell you? It tells you they're not serious about this higher function of completely oblivious.
Well, I'm sure some faculty members are applauding that right now. I mean, the endowment at Princeton, of course, there's some earmarks there. There's certain things they can't spend it all. They can't spend it all on one thing necessarily. I hear you, but
come on, Ian.
Fair enough. I'm not going to hold the water for Princeton on that one. But
$7 billion for an undergraduate population or a total school population of under 10,000 students. It's nuts.
Well, this is maybe a good portion. I mean, you've called Princeton a perpetual motion machine, meaning it's just basically it's in the business of keeping itself in business in that sense. I want to take that little notion, though, and not necessarily pivot myself to saying yesterday in some arguments at the Supreme Court over the future of race-based, race-conscious admissions, you were noted by Justice Gorsuch in an argument about privilege, at least at Harvard. I think the justice got the institution wrong. It should have been Princeton. But I want to use that kind of pivot here to talk to you a little bit about that case. What was heard yesterday in the 5 hours of discussion at the Supreme Court. Most people are assuming that the court is going to strike down or change what is precedent about race-based admissions in this country. What do you think that does? Where do you think this heads? What are your concerns about that, if you have any?
Well, without knowing how this all shakes out, I will say that I am, I think, doing away with, I guess, let me just back up and say, the thing that is at the heart of this, and that is so, is so distressing to conservatives on the court, correctly distressing to conservatives on the court, is that elite schools in this country, who are the ones, the affirmative action battle is really one we're talking about the top, it's an issue in the top, 25% of schools. Let's just use that for. They have shown a consistent failure to be honest about the extreme subjectivity of their admissions process. So they like to pretend that they're running things through algorithms and they're allocating here and there. They're not. They're they're doing all kinds of side deals for legacies and for big donors and for students who have, idiosyncratic athletic abilities so they can. I mean, there's an ongoing scam when it comes to admissions to elite schools. And I think what the court is saying is what, you guys are running this kind of this scam when it comes to why should we as a court somehow humor you if you want to turn up valuable admissions spots into if you want to pretend you have some kind of high-minded function here. Right? I think the schools have surrendered their right to the moral high ground. That's why we're in this mess. If schools are really honest about, we are letting in a number of students from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds because we feel as an institution, we can educate them properly and give them greater opportunity they would have had otherwise. I don't think anyone has a problem with that. They're not doing that. They're playing this game where they're letting in, little Susie, whose only qualification is how much money her dad has, and then they're simultaneously turning around and saying, we're this noble institution that is trying. No, you can't have it both ways. Clean your own house, and we won't have these divisive public controversies.
No, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, you've seen the Washington Post do a poll not too long ago that the majority of Americans were skeptical of race-based admissions, but also certainly skeptical of legacy admissions as well. And so when you kind of come close to this idea about how admissions is made in this country, I think people are becoming more and more skeptical, it seems, especially of the more elite institutions, the more selective institutions.
I also have a problem with the argument that says that the single best way for someone who is disadvantaged to get ahead is to go to the absolutely most prestigious school they can get into.
Hmm.
I just think there's the evidence from HBCUs, for example, says that outcomes, graduation outcomes, job outcomes, income outcomes from going to an HBCU for many minority kids are far better than.
Right.
So if you have to take that fact seriously, you have to say, no, wait a minute. So what is the best route to advancement for somebody who's been denied a set of opportunities? And so what has happened with affirmative action is we blindly said, oh, if we can lower a set of standards and let some disadvantaged kid go to an Ivy, we're making that kid's life better off. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. I think an honest conversation about that would be, when I did my episode on Dillard and spoke to the administrators at these HBCUs, they're quite candid. They think that the Ivies are squandering a lot of the dropout rates are so high. Kids are moving out of STEM programs and into quote unquote easier programs. And they look at that and they say they're squandering the intellectual capital of our community. So, I mean, when you're hearing that from HBCU people, you've got to kind of raise an eyebrow here and be a bit more skeptical of this kind of mythology that says we're all better off if only we can get into an Ivy League school. And so I'm sorry, that's just false, right?
I mean, in one of your podcasts, you really took on this idea that higher education is leaving too much talent on the table. And what you meant by that is sort of you looked at a specific student, Carlos. This was a pseudonym for a student who you felt like was a good example of a student, high achieving, and but all the help that needed him just to get into college. What did you learn from interviewing him about what is so fragile about talent in this country, and what can higher education do better about it? You've pointed to HBCUs. Is there some models, some policies, some things there that our folks who are watching here can kind of learn more about and perhaps bring to their own institution?
Well, the point of that episode of Revisionist History was called Carlos Doesn't Remember. Was really a kind of statistical point, and I am, this is based on work that a number of academics have done, which is fairly well known now, which just says, if we use the crudest of measures, which is how many kids coming out of high school score on a standardized test above X, pick it, 80th percentile. So kids who are, let's use that as a rough proxy for a kid who's highly intellectually able, right? If you look at the universe of kids who score above that point, who are clearly in the top level intellectually, how many of them end up at a school that matches their capacities? The answer is, if they're upper middle class and white, lots of them. If they are disadvantaged and Black, a tiny fraction of them, or Hispanic, or from some kind of impoverished background. So what that says is that simply if we look at, if you think about one of the jobs of higher ed is to find bright minds and help them develop, that we know as a statistical fact that higher ed is failing at that job, that what they're doing is locating the kids who are easiest to find, the ones who have wealthy parents and are going to nice suburban schools and have come with a complete package, and they are failing at the kids who are hard to find, who are in the hills of Appalachia, who have a family that doesn't have the money to pay for airfare to go across, or whatever, you can come up with 10 different reasons, or who just have never had in their life a role model who has gone to college. So they're unaware that that's and yet they have within them the capacity to thrive in an intellectual atmosphere. We know as an empirical fact that we as a society do a bad job of capitalizing on that talent. So that ought to sober, I think, the entire higher ed community and say, no, wait a minute, maybe this ought to be another measure of excellence, is how good are we at finding the diamonds in the rough?
And I do think many folks in higher education do think that way. I mean, and they realize they want to do a better job at it too. I mean, obviously it depends on the institution. I do think they're having more conversations about it. Of course, as a reporter for a newspaper that focuses on this, I'm aware of it and may not be reaching all the levels that you may be seeing it. And I realize that. I do think that they're trying to have more of those conversations about what we broadly call student success, getting the students into the pipeline, getting them through the school as well. In many ways, back to your point about HBCUs, who do a very good job of that with certain folks from disadvantaged backgrounds, they are definitely trying to figure out how do we emulate some of those ideas at different schools.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I have
want.
I was going to,
Oh, please go ahead, Malcolm.
well, I was just going to say a cousin of mine did her undergrad at GW and then her law degree at Howard. She's Black, and she said that if she had, knowing what she knows now, she would never in a million years have gone to GW. That there was just no, for someone from her background, there was no, and that goes to this question of what you're just saying, that our awareness, I think an 18-year-old's awareness of the options, the differences in the options that are available to them. I think that's another area where we need to do a better job of kind of communicating, instead of every school only communicating through these statistical grids created by the ranking agencies.
Right.
Schools got to do a better job of kind of explaining who they are and what they do and why they would work for a certain kind of student.
Oh, I hear you about that, getting a better sense of what the landscape is and what fits for you. And we hear talk more about that, what's the right fit for students, but I think that's really hard. I mean, heck, it's hard for any 18-year-old to know that, but I think in some ways it's how do you make sure that they kind of have it lined up, and it's telling about the person you just mentioned at GW as well.
I'm a big runner, and I always joke now that knowing what I know now, if someone had said to me at 18, here's a school, it's a pretty good school, we take it very seriously, we're only letting in people, it's really just for serious runners. You have to be running like 50 miles a week to get in. That's actually kind of genius. And it sounds trivial and absurd, but it's an organizing principle. It says, we want to create an atmosphere where people take fitness very seriously, where people are disciplined, where, like those are all, that's why when you think about why would a kid choose to go to a service academy? Or it's because they want a similar kind of thing. They want to be surrounded by a group of people who are, patriotic, disciplined, focused, have already willing to make a commitment at the age of 18 to serving their country for X number of years. You should be able to choose those kinds of environments. There's a portion of people who want to be surrounded by people who think that way.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that you're not done when it comes to your poking at higher education. Where do you want to take it next? Where would you like to take, what's something that you're interested in to focus on next?
Well, we're going to do, I think in the next season of Revisionist History, a big thing on Hope College, this school out of Michigan that wants to do away with tuition, which really, really interests me. Going to that idea, and I wanted to really pursue this idea of alternate models. There ought to be 5 different ways in which you can pay your tuition. That strikes me as being, it shouldn't just be one. That's one area. I'd love to revisit. I did a little thing once on funding for university level research and how kind of weird it is.
Oh, right. And you argued that it should just be sort of a lottery, potentially.
Just
I'm sure the NIH loves that one.
Well, the people who came up with the argument for the lottery were people who worked at NIH. So
That's great.
From them, they did the research showing that peer review doesn't work. So, I mean, I think they would be all over this idea. But I would like to, one interesting question is to try and get at is, what is the optimal amount of money that a successful or healthy society ought to be spending on higher ed? We rarely approach it that way. We just kind of, we go through fits and starts. No one can say, for example, what size should the NIH budget be? We have political arguments. We don't have kind of functional arguments. Or what is the appropriate level of state assistance for a public institution in terms of maximizing outcomes? And like it was at one level in 1955. It's at a very different level today. Can someone look closely at that and tell me, well, what would be the correct range for that? Those are really interesting questions. I think that would be fun to explore.
Oh, I look forward to hearing more about that and as you explore higher education. I do want to have a little bit of a whimsical conversation with you at the end, but here and introduce you to my kid's dinosaur.
No.
This is a dinosaur that I brought on last year's Cronfest to give you some context here. Basically saying, hey, many people feel like higher ed is like this, right? They feel like it's a lumbering giant that's slow to evolve and that others predict is on the verge of extinction. So first, forgive me for the hackneyed metaphor in that. But second, I mean, do you think the American higher education system is this dinosaur that's not evolving fast enough to survive as it is today? Do you feel like it's has what's its future? I guess is my question.
Yeah. I don't think it's a lumbering dinosaur. I don't think you can call the whole thing a
Right.
lumbering.
Back to your point about diversity in the system.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of, so long as there are passionate, engaged teachers who want to educate students and share knowledge with them, and students who want to learn from those kinds of people, system's fine. Like that's the core of this, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
And there are not just thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students and teachers professors in this country who fit that description. So I don't have, on that kind of most macro of levels, I think this is fantastic. All around America right now, there are kids coming out of class excited about what they just learned, in the library reading something they never heard before. So that's not that. There's nothing dinosaurish about that. That's evergreen. That's
Right.
going on for thousands of years and will go on for thousands of years.
Maybe the part of the tradition that higher education, because it was slow to move, it was slow to evolve in some senses. The bad side we talk about, but the good side is holding on to these, hopefully the Socratic method and these traditional ways of teacher and student interacting.
I would do a kind of left brain, right brain thing.
Hmm.
I would say that the right brain is super healthy. The creative parts are fantastic. Like I said, those kinds of, by which I mean those kinds of interactions between teachers and students, the work of researchers, the intellectual discovery that goes on, all of that right brain stuff is. The left brain is in need of help.
Right.
So it's I would just say everything from the administrators on up, the boards, the presidents, the people in state legislatures who fund these institutions, the donors. Those are the ones I have concerns about. I don't have any concern about the kind of core pedagogical. I always have trouble with that word.
It's a big long word. We'd like to say in higher ed sometimes.
Right. But I also don't think, think about, it was really interesting during COVID to see the level of psychological distress among college-age students who were denied a real college education.
Yeah.
They suffered. Why did they suffer? Because they went in search of a kind of personal interaction and they had to sit in front of a computer. What did that tell us? It tells us that personal interaction inside these institutions we've built is incredibly powerful and important and magical. I mean, it's magical. And we extinguished the magic for 2 years and a bunch of kids still haven't recovered. That was a wake-up call. I mean, I have to say that really, I realized after that, maybe in some of my previous writing, I have been too dismissive or too much of I've painted too broad a brush in my attacks on, I see Michael Crow is coming on. So he's exactly what I'm talking about, right? There's who wants to walk to the beat of a different drummer, right? He's exactly what we need. 100 Michael Crows, each pursuing something idiosyncratic and different and weird and imaginative to fix the system. He's the functional left brain of this system.
And my colleague Goldie Blumenstick's going to interview Mike. Will bring up some of these topics in the next session, certainly. I do want to ask you, I brought up my kid's dinosaur here, and I've got some kids who are older than yours. I believe you're a relatively new father. Yeah. I mean, your child and my kids even are pretty far away from higher ed, but as we kind of wrap up here, I mean, what advice do you give people? Do people come up to you and ask you for advice for their kids? Do they say, like, what do you suggest for them? Is it, hey, look at places like Hope College, consider West Point. I mean, just consider the breadth that you have out there, not the narrow blinders many people may say they put on themselves when they look at higher ed.
So what advice would I give my daughter 17 years from now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, how's that? I would say,
we're distilling the question.
I would say go to a place full of people who are not like you. Don't pursue what you're good at, pursue what you're interested in, and be smart enough to understand that those don't necessarily Those are not necessarily the same thing. And do lots of sports, but do sports badly. In other words, don't try to pretend you're going to be an Olympic athlete and do 7 hours a day, but like play touch football with your friends, or play soccer, or go for a nice long run on the weekends. Enjoy. The whole point of going to school is you have the time and the leisure to do a whole variety of fun things with your friends, and maybe one of those should be like a 6-mile run on Saturday mornings. That would make me very happy as a father.
That's great. I appreciate that, Malcolm. I like the ideas of higher ed staying weird, and folks continue to explore and trying sports that they may not be good at, or if that matters, subjects as well. But I appreciate it, Malcolm. Thank you very much for being part of CronFest, the Chronicle Festival, and thank you very much for your thoughts on higher education.
Thanks, Ian.